My daughter read the Back to Godhead magazine. Came home, we lived in Santa Barbara, with her magazines. She had more than one, I think. Locked herself in the bedroom, and for 2 days she did nothing but read. And when she came out, we were sure that there was something that needed investigating. But came Saturday, and she said she was leaving for Los Angeles to come to the temple. And of course, we trusted that whatever she was reading and pertained to this temple was something that we should be satisfied was innocent enough. But a week later, my husband and I came to visit. And it so happens that day, that weekend, Prabhupada was here. And so we met in the building across the street, the first building. And I remember Prabhupada sat on the upper level while the chairs and seats for everybody else was down, just a little bit down below. And questions were asked of him. And of course, I raised my hand because I didn't know what this was all about. And I said, if this is such a good thing for all people to become involved in, why did it take so long to come to us? And he said, you were late. And suddenly all the devotees to my right, back there, let up a howl of joy. And he turned to them and he said, and you were all late.
Some dignitaries would come from Krishnagar, and so one morning we saw some blinking, police car lights coming, and we said, oh, some hotshots coming out, to visit. And it turned out to be the Indian secret police. And at that time, the Bangladesh war was going on, and they came into our property, and they got out of the cars, and they said, we've come to arrest Americans for being spies, CIA agents. And so at that time, there was only two, myself and Jaya Gaura. And so they said, we'll take one of you, because they didn't know what they were doing either. They said, we'll take one of you, and if we can prove that you're a spy, we'll come and arrest the others later. And so I said, okay, Jaya Gaura, he's more important to the Mayapur project than me. So I said, take me. And so they put me in shackles and drove me to Krishnagar, and then again transported me from there to Calcutta. And in Calcutta, the US Embassy was notified that they had arrested a spy, and they sent someone to act as my legal aid. And we'd gone to court several times, and eventually they proved that I wasn't a spy. But in that intern, my visa had expired. And so the government of India wanted to save face, so they sentenced me to 6 months in prison. And the prison was very, I had like a 10-foot by 8-foot room with no toilet, nothing, just a cement floor, and I had to stay in there. And finally, when I was released, Srila Prabhupada, had, he called me into his room. He had heard about this, and he was in Bombay when I was arrested, but then he was on his way to outside of the country. But then when he returned, I got released, and then he called me into his room, and he said, first he said, how are you? How are you? And I said, I'm okay, Srila Prabhupada. And he says, do you want to go back to America? So I said, no, Srila Prabhupada, I want to go back to Mayapur and do my service. And then he said, oh, that's very good. And then he began to, tell me the story. He said, there was once a little boy, and this boy had a terrible father who, in so many ways, became envious of him because he was a devotee of Krishna. And he tried in so many ways to torture him and to change his way of behaving. And and then I realized he's talking about Prahlad Maharaj. And then he says, yes, the devotees of Krishna, they are willing to go to hell. To know that even though he's not present, he's still thinking of his devotees, wherever they are in the world. Because, in the Srimad Bhagavatam, at that time, he mentions that his disciples are being arrested. He doesn't use my name, but the circumstances are, because of the time that he was, he could have been in Australia or wherever he was, in the middle of the night, doing his translations, having concern for his, his disciples, and so.
My first contact with Srila Prabhupada, my first personal contact, was when I went on a morning walk with him. I was just a young boy. I think I hadn't even joined the temple, but I had heard that Srila Prabhupada was coming, and the devotees encouraged me to stay overnight and see Prabhupada. He came, and he went on a morning walk before class, as he does, and we went near Bury Place. There was a small park, Russell Square, and there was about 10 devotees with Srila Prabhupada. And I was the new boy, I was the bhakta, I was the... so I was behind. There was a jostling, as I later discovered, but I was behind. And I had a great difficulty to understand Srila Prabhupada. He had this unusual accent, this Bengali accent with which I just wasn't familiar. I think I was about 17 or 18. I hadn't had a lot of exposure to Indian people anyhow. And I was straining to hear what he said. So I was walking behind, and I was straining with, just trying to catch the words, and there was the feet on the gravel. There was a lot of ambient sound, so I was straining to kind of filter things through. And I clipped Prabhupada's heel. And Srila Prabhupada walked about 2 or 3 paces without the shoe on. And so he stopped, everyone stopped, and Prabhupada turned, and he looked at me. And he knew what I had clipped his heel. And he said, you must always walk 3 feet behind the spiritual master. And I was completely mortified. And there was this one devotee. He said to me, this is a grave offense. He said, you should immediately kill yourself. He said, you should jump in the Thames, jump off the river, and immediately, he said, for purification. So I thought, oh no, what have I done? I haven't even started, and I've set off on a bad foot. So it was much later, I was recounting to one of my sannyasi godbrothers, and he said, that is the moment when Srila Prabhupada accepted you as his disciple. He said that was his first instruction to you. You must always walk 3 paces behind the spiritual master.
One time I remember Prabhupada was, I was first introduced to Prabhupada with some other Library Party members. Satsvarup Maharaj, our leader, was introducing us one by one. So Prabhupada looked at me when he said my name, and like so many of my godbrothers, I felt like he was looking right through me. And I felt like a little insignificant speck of dust in the universe, and completely unworthy of being engaged in his service. So I was feeling that way. And I heard from Shruti Kirti in one of his books about what Prabhupada was really thinking in his perception when he would look at people that way. He was thinking, how can I engage this person in Krishna service? I'm thinking, I'm unworthy to be engaged in Krishna service. He's thinking, how can I engage this person in Krishna service? When I heard that, then some of Prabhupada's gravity became very clear to me, what he was really thinking. And I wish I had known that at that time. You know, I would have felt more enthused instead of what I felt, which was like crawling in a hole somewhere.
So there was devotees from all over Europe. So there were many devotees to be initiated, get first and second. So my name was put added to the list. So I was like the last name on the list. And there are pictures in the BTG of the big ceremony, the big, all the fruit, and under those beautiful trees. And so, you know, I think it was Guru, what's his name? Oh, well, anyways, there were those two sannyasis that gave a presentation because Srila Prabhupada was sick at that time, at the time of the Krishna Balaram installation. So when it was time for the actual giving the japa and giving the vows to Srila Prabhupada, and everybody was called, so I was called, you know, after a lot, you know, everybody. And so when I got in front of Srila Prabhupada, since I came from Brazil and I speak Portuguese, at that time my English was like ABC. And I did not know how to say the four principles in English. But I was so sure of myself that what I was doing. I was taking initiation from Srila Prabhupada, and I was, you know, there in front of him. So I just looked at him and I said the vows in Portuguese. So when I finished saying the vows in Portuguese, he looked around to one side, he looked to the other side. I guess nobody knew what was happening. So that gave him, you know, the reason to look really deep in me. So he looked at me with you know, people that were looked by Srila Prabhupada know the eyes that can see this life, past lives, and all, you know, the dirt in your heart and the good things that you have, if you have any. So he actually saw me, so he paid attention in me. And at that time, he had like 10,000 disciples. So by me speaking Portuguese, gave me the chance to call Srila Prabhupada's attention. So he noticed me. So, you know, there was something that he noticed about me, so he paid attention. So that was my first initiation. So he gave me the name, your name is Jaya Gaura Devi Dasi. So that was beautiful. It was it was a big party, and it was, you know, transcendental.
First time I physically saw him was in New York Temple, Henry Street. It's 1972. It's right after the Ratha Yatra. And I had met devotees in Texas, and they had encouraged me to go and meet Prabhupada there. And so I went with my teacher, my sculpture teacher, Murti, who later became Murti Das. And we just got to the Henry Street Temple, and a devotee before us had told Prabhupada's servant that two artists were coming to meet Prabhupada. One was a professor at a university. We weren't there 20 minutes before we were escorted up into Prabhupada's rooms. And we got up to there was a sort of an ante-room, just a kind of an area before you went into his rooms proper. And we were left there, and you could smell the fresh paint everywhere. White walls, no, blue walls, powder blue walls with white trim. And Prabhupada wasn't in his room. He was actually down the stairs using the restroom. And so when I first saw Prabhupada, we heard this patter, patter of feet coming up the stairs, and we were just standing there, you know, like deers in the headlight. And Prabhupada came up, and he was just dressed in his gamcha, and he had his Brahmin thread wrapped around his ear. And we both hit the floor. At that point, we didn't even know the prayers, it was like just blah, And so my first impression of Prabhupada was how regal he was, even in this very domestic, situation. Just how regal he was. And he immediately, first words out of his mouth is, "I'm not a king. This is not for me. This is an educational facility for teaching Krishna consciousness." And he could tell that my teacher and I were, pretty wound up. And so he immediately started with small talk. We went into his room. He sat down behind his desk. And he just started asking us about Vishnu Jana Swami, about Texas. Is it hot there? Do you like wearing dhotis in Texas? I mean, just stuff, And so that sort of broke the ice. And then Aravinda, who was his secretary, he asked him to bring in a painting of Panchatattva. And it was actually a drawing, I think. And he knew we were sculptors, and so he said, can you do this? Can you produce these? We'd like to put them in our temples all over the world. And where we were coming from, we were these sculptors in Texas at this very liberal university, Austin, Texas. And I had worked a little bit with figurative work and taken a lot of life drawing, but I'd never really done clay figurative pieces. I'd done only steel abstract things. And Murti Das was coming from the same space. And I said, "Yes, Prabhupada, we can do it." And Murti Das was a little wiser than I was. He said, "We'll try." And so Prabhupada asked us, and he even gave us a size. He said, about 40 inches, And so years later, we produced a set of Panchatattva for Hawaii. And before we sent them, I measured them, and they were about 40 inches. I mean, it was, it's like we hadn't planned it. It had just kind of happened that way. But anyway, that was my first impression of Prabhupada.
We were in Vrindavan and got to clean his quarters every day. And then every day after lunch, Prabhupada would rest. And when he got up at 4 o'clock usually, we'd bring him fresh juice, a fresh garland, and sandalwood pulp. And so I had to make the garland one day. I had to find the flowers. First of all, it's not like it is today. You go to Vrindavan and outside you have 1 million flowers you can purchase. At that time outside there was 0 flowers you could purchase. You had to go all the way in town to the Banki Bihari temple where they had some flowers outside of that temple. And somehow I scrounged up some flowers and made a nice garland with marigolds and roses. And I was less intelligent somehow and put some water in that garland before I put it in the fridge. And when they came and when they put it in Prabhupada, it was apparently wet. And he took it off immediately. And that was a chastisement that went deep into my heart, that he didn't accept my garland that time. And I just realized, we have to really use our intelligence and the best of everything for the Guru. Otherwise, he might not accept our service. So that was a deep realization.
Right away, the devotees had realized that we don't have a Vyasa-san for Prabhupada. And Bahudak immediately, he knew I had some carpentry experience, so he immediately surrendered me to Dhanavir Prabhu, who was the temple president there, and said, Dharmatma, well, I wasn't Dharmatma then, I wasn't even initiated. Maybe I was, but he said, he'll do it, So then the first question was, what's the Vyasa-san, Because none of us had seen one. There wasn't one in Portland, and there wasn't one in Vancouver. But luckily someone produced a picture of I believe the LA one. So I had something to go on. But the catch was Prabhupada was going to be there in 2 days. So anyway, I started busying myself, and I was in a foreign city, so I didn't know what to do. It's not like, there was Home Depots and Lowe's on every corner. So I finally got all the materials together, and I basically worked day and night until it got to the day that Prabhupada was arriving. So, and at that time, when Prabhupada was coming, all the devotees, they all left for the airport. And here myself and maybe 2 other devotees were left there. And I was feeling a little bit left out. And I was feeling, well, why? Why? Of course, I was naive and young. I didn't understand that I'm getting the opportunity to make this Vyasasan for the Jagat Guru, of the universe. And so I finished it. I was getting close to finishing it. And all of a sudden, the devotees started yelling, "He's coming, he's coming. Hurry!" And there's, devotees are scattering around, and then cars pulling up, and devotees running into the temple room, and it became crazy. And here I was in my dirty dhoti, and I was so frantic. I'm trying to get my tools off the Vyasasan, and finally I got it done, and I'm looking at it. Okay, it's all right. No tools or screwdrivers or anything sitting there. And then Prabhupada walks in. So then he offered dandavats to the deities, and then he got up and he looked around, he was smiling at the devotees, and then he started his walk back to the Vyasasan. And he's walking, and then all of a sudden I got this cold chill down my back, and I began panicking. And the reason was that I had remembered that I forgot to secure the back of the Vyasasan. I had just tacked in a couple of nails just to hold it, and I was going to put the bolts in later. But with the frantic pace, I forgot to do it. So I just, it was the most horrific feeling. I was just terrified that Prabhupada, I was thinking, all these things went through my mind. He's going to lean back and the whole thing's going to fall down. And anyway, he came and he did something really amazing. And I probably was the only one to see it, or maybe it didn't happen. It was one of those things where he walked to the Vyasasan. Instead of going up to the front, he kind of walked to the side and he looked at the back like this. And then he turned around, and then he came, and he had that same smile on his face, and then he walked to the front, and he walked up the 2 steps that I made, and he walks on, and he sits on the Vyasasan. And I don't remember what the context of his class was, because the whole time I was just I was sweating, and I was totally freaking out. But as it was, he finished the lecture, and the devotees were ecstatic, and I was so relieved because Prabhupada never leaned back once. He sat the whole time and gave the class. He got down, and he gave pranams to all the devotees, and he left. So I was thinking that how fortunate I was that I had that service, and Krishna actually, I felt that Krishna had saved me because Prabhupada never leaned back, So I learned a lesson that any service I did for Srila Prabhupada, I should try to do it to the best of my ability. That was a lesson that I learned from that I was doing it in haste, but I should always be thinking, that I have to do this the best of my ability for Srila Prabhupada. And that's pretty much what I learned from that incident.
Another beautiful lesson in pastime with Srila Prabhupada that I was fortunate enough to be at was on La Cienega Temple in Los Angeles. I remember once that we put a play on for Srila Prabhupada, and it was the drama from Chaitanya Charitamrita, where Lord Chaitanya is floating in the ocean in ecstasy, remembering pastimes of Radha Krishna. And the fisherman touches Lord Chaitanya, and the devotees are running all over because they don't know where Lord Chaitanya is. They can't find him, and they see the fisherman. So they know, of course, that the fisherman must have come in contact with Lord Chaitanya. So this was Vishnujan Swami and Mohanananda. And Vishnujan was running around chanting like a madman because he had touched Lord Chaitanya. And Prabhupada was enjoying it so much. He was laughing and laughing and enjoying it. So Prabhupada was not dry. Prabhupada always saw the ecstasy in Krishna consciousness. On one lecture, Prabhupada said, you cannot advance in Krishna consciousness unless you're joyful. So that's why Prabhupada told us, chant Hare Krishna and be happy. So Krishna consciousness is a joyful process, and Prabhupada always exemplified that. And again, this was an example of Prabhupada encouraging
the devotees. It wasn't a professional play. It was the early days. There wasn't a lot of, paraphernalia that was professionally made. But Prabhupada enjoyed it so much, and then after, I remember we went out and had a darshan, and again he was saying how nice the plays were, and how nice and how you should do plays like this all the time. Nowadays you don't see so much, the dramas. But Prabhupada so much enjoyed that, and just enjoyed seeing his devotees, where he could, engage in a reciprocation with them. That's what Prabhupada relished. That was the personal relationship that we all have with Srila Prabhupada. Prabhupada, it's like Krishna, they said, Anor Niyan Mahato Mahayan. He's smaller than the smallest, and he's greater than the greatest. So Srila Prabhupada had that aspect as Jagat Guru, greater than the greatest. But yet, he would relate to us on an individual level and reciprocate with us in love. So that's very beautiful characteristic and quality of Srila Prabhupada. Very, very personal.
I took initiation, Brahminical initiation from Srila Prabhupada at that time. I went out and collected Dakchin and sent a letter to him with the Dakchin saying, what do you want me to do? What can I do? And so then Prabhupada sent me a letter back in '73. And this was like the letter that changed my life, and I'll just read it real quickly. This was March 24th, 1973. Please accept my blessings. I beg to acknowledge receipt of your letter and enclosed Dakchin. Regarding murti making, yes, I want that those who can do it nicely, they should go to Mayapur and take instruction there on how to make murtis, and especially dolls. We want to make dolls of Krishna Lila. So I didn't have any conception of what this was. Just like in London, I was seeing thousands of people going to the wax museum to see dolls of dead men, and even they were paying to see them. So we want to make dolls of all the wonderful activities of Lord Shri Krishna, and just by seeing people will get spiritual benefit from it. So you consult with Karundar and do the needful. That was Prabhupada's letter to me.
Srila Prabhupada, he would give the most wonderful practical examples to explain the most difficult philosophical concepts for us, his aspiring disciples. One time in Vrindavan, Srila Prabhupada was struggling to present to us in terms that we could understand the fact that everything is absolutely conscious and sentient in the spiritual world. So he paused for a short time, and then he said, just like when Radharani is cooking for Krishna, she will ask the rice in the pot, are you ready yet? And the rice will say, no, not yet, give me a few more minutes.
In 1974 in Mayapur, after the festival time, a series of events unfolded, beginning with the idea that a lot of devotees were sick, and Prabhupada had brought in the leaders into his room, in front room in the Lotus Building, and it was Jaya Maharaj and Tamal Krishna, Narada Muni especially, and so he was explaining how he wasn't satisfied that the devotees were sleeping. He'd been up, I even saw this, that he was up on the upper floors, and he saw a lot of people sick and sleeping, and they should have been on parikrama. It was like 8 in the morning, quite late. So at the time, when I was looking through the window, he was talking to them, explaining, they were blaming each other and saying none of them had enough money to get better food. So Prabhupada kind of paused, and he said, just before that, this fellow Sudama Vipra, who was a sannyasi at the time, he was a friend of Siddhaswarupa's, very good friend, bodyguard, very tough guy. He had gone to the Philippines. Prabhupada praised him for his preaching, but at the same time, he didn't want anyone to come to the Philippines. He'd even threatened them severely, the other GBCs. And Prabhupada knew all this, and I happened to know it. So at the time that Prabhupada came in, Sudama came in, at the same time Chaco was sitting there. He was a Bengali worker, Muslim, but he loved Prabhupada. He loved to sit there and listen to Prabhupada. And so during the course of the conversation, Prabhupada saw Sudama Vipra. The others didn't see him come in. He was sitting behind them. And Prabhupada said, so if you require money, Sudama Vipra will supply. And he went with his hand like this, and then they turned around and they saw Sudama Vipra sitting there. Same time, they were kind of shocked that Prabhupada would say that, because the last person in ISKCON who would have given him a dime or a paisa would be Sudama Vipra. And in a split second, Sudama Vipra took off his expensive watch and just handed it to Chaku, and so that Prabhupada could see how munificent he was. And it was just a snippet or something completely amazing to me, that Prabhupada's wit or his something, intelligence, just so sharp. And whether or not Sudama Vipra understood the message there, that's something we'll never know. But he gave the watch, and at the same time shocked those leaders, and because probably they knew that there's no way that he would ever give them a dime. He'd rather kill them than give them money, basically. I think he had said pretty much the similar thing. So this is one of the pastimes of Prabhupada's wit, wisdom, vast intelligence.
But it wasn't until about a year later, or two, I think, when he came back to visit. And that was when we met and spoke much more. In fact, that afternoon, Prabhupada gave me his lunch and told us, me and my husband, how glad he was that we were taking an interest. And he asked us a little bit about ourselves. And I remember he asked Sam what kind of a business he was in. And Sam said he was in the used furniture. He said, used like people like me, he said.
We were walking along, and Kurukshetra said to Srila Prabhupada that Srila Prabhupada Radha Damodar sometimes does 100 books at the library at the zoo on Saturday. And Prabhupada, I didn't know that Prabhupada even knew my name, but Prabhupada was way at the front with so many old sannyasis and big shots there. And Prabhupada immediately jumped off the sidewalk, he hopped over a little rock, he ran back to the back and ran right to my nose. He said, "Oh, big books?" And I said, "Oh, no, Srila Prabhupada, mostly coloring books and small." And he said, "Oh, small." And I was really surprised that he knew me personally. That was a big thing for me, that, he has so many thousands of disciples. But when they mentioned Radha Damodar, he immediately ran right over to me and, wanted to know about the book distribution.
I had made garlands, and the garlands, we used to put down a madras in the kitchen area around the other side of the temple towards where the garden is. And we used to make garlands. And of course, I made some of the gardenia garlands that Srila Prabhupada wore, the white gardenia garlands. I was lucky enough to do that. But it was my habit to time when Prabhupada was coming out on his walk, and I would grab a fresh rose, break it off, run around, when Prabhupada came out, and give him, the flower, and he would give me a flower back. So that particular year, Karundar, I think he had a friend, or he knew somebody that leased Rolls Royces. And they had 3 Rolls Royces for Srila Prabhupada. One was a black Rolls Royce, one was a white Rolls Royce, and one was a white and silver Rolls Royce. And every day, Karundar would drive the Rolls Royce. I believe it was Karundar, sometimes it was Jaya Tirtha, would drive the Rolls Royce up, and Srila Prabhupada would get in. So that particular morning, I was late bringing the rose around. So I tear out around the temple. I come around where the temple entrance is and around to where Srila Prabhupada's quarter is. And the Rolls Royce was already pulling out. And the momentum carried me somewhat around the corner. So the Rolls Royce was just about to approach Watsika Avenue from the alleyway. And I'm standing there looking towards the Rolls Royce with a wistful look. Oh, I missed Srila Prabhupada this morning. My day is going to be ruined now for sure. So all of a sudden, the Rolls Royce backs up, and Srila Prabhupada opens up the window and holds his hand out and accepts the rose for me. So you can see, I mean, I'm practically in Krishna consciousness. I was like a non-entity. I mean, I don't even know whether Srila Prabhupada knew who I was, or, you know, I'm sure he knew who I was, but I didn't have any, I wasn't a big personality. I was a very, you know, small personality. And Srila Prabhupada, in his kindness, that's the only importance that I'm ever going to have in my life, is the fact that Srila Prabhupada backed the Rolls Royce up, told Jaya Tirtha to back it up, and held his hand out. So that definitely made my life, not just my day, my life.
I was in Mayapur. One of my duties when I first got there was to make up sandalwood paste. And I could put sandalwood paste on Prabhupada's forehead before he gave class in the morning. And so I was so proud of myself. I'm doing this service. And the first couple of mornings, everything was okay. You know, I thought, wow, okay, I got this down. You know, I know how to make it just the right, you know, thickness to where it stays on his forehead nicely. And then second or third morning, Prabhupada uttered something, and I couldn't understand what he said. I said, "What's Srila Prabhupada?" And he uttered it again, and I still couldn't understand what he said. And finally, the third time, I guess it was Shruti Kirti or whoever his servant was, said, "Use your right hand," because I'm left-handed, and I was putting the flowers on them. So that was an instructional, you know, tidbit from Srila Prabhupada.
The temple brahmachari commander, temple commander said, before Prabhupada came, we're going to put a big thing of leaves on the ground to make a soft carpet for Srila Prabhupada's lotus feet. And so, you know, we just figured, okay, we're told to do it. Let's just go spread them around. Let's go spread the old leaves around there. And so when Prabhupada came, he saw all the leaves all over the place, and he said that this is not good. You know, that all the neighbors, they're keeping a clean yard, and that why can't we just why can't we have a clean yard like the neighbors? You know, there's all these leaves, they bring insects, you know. But the way he was telling us, it was just like a whole ocean of humility, you know. It was just like so astounding, just the way he just dealt with people in everyday affairs, you know. It wasn't, well, it was another incredible thing. I mean, it's just like, it's all incredible just to see.
And then another time I was in Calcutta. This is in 1975 or 76. And there was a devotee who wanted to get married. He was a brahmachari. He was an English devotee, Vedamata. And he wanted to ask Srila Prabhupada if he could get married. So there was hardly anyone there. So he asked me to go into the room with him. So, you know, he knocked on the door and Prabhupada said, "Come in." And we went in. And so he asked Prabhupada, "Srila Prabhupada, I want to get married. Is it all right if I get married?" So the only thing Prabhupada says, "Yes, but how will you maintain your wife?" That was all he said. So that was instructive because, you know, if you've got to get married, you've got to figure out how to make some money to maintain the wife.
So Srila Prabhupada, he was very tricky at times also, and he knew the mentality of different people and how exactly to deal with them. In Vrindavan, Prabhupada was pretty exasperated because none of his disciples were willing to stay in Vrindavan, the management, or were they qualified to deal with the goings-on in India and so on. So he always had a great difficulty finding management to run the place and to stay there. Very, very, which again was why he had spent so much time there. So one time he thought that a solution was to get some local trusted people involved so that they would be our trustees and they would take care of things very nicely. So there was one gentleman, he was a brahmachari, lifelong brahmachari, and he lived right round the corner. And eventually, he just lived round the corner, and devotees got to know him, they brought him to Prabhupada. He had some type of, I guess, some kind of rheumatoid conditions in his hip, so he had difficulty. It was painful for him to move around and so on. But he would take the rickshaw. He had been a brahmachari, but he had a mill in which he would mill different seeds and oil seeds and so on. So he had made a bit of money, he had taken care of his family and so on. But he was a sadhu at heart. He had retired early and he just wanted to be involved in his bhajan. He knew the entire Bhagavad Gita by heart, and he would take a rickshaw from Ramanreti into town in which he would recite half of the Bhagavad Gita. And then on the way back, he would recite the other half. So he was just completely brahmachari and trained and focused and just really wanted to complete his bhajan in this lifetime. Of course, Srila Prabhupada wanted him to get involved in helping with the temple. So there was a conflict between them, and Prabhupada would ask him, and he'd find all these ways to avoid doing things, and Prabhupada very much was... so there was this chess game going on between them, and each was resistant. He was very respectful of Srila Prabhupada, and he recognized Srila Prabhupada's superior position. And Srila Prabhupada would explain to him that preaching is more important than bhajan, that this is a higher calling. And so he was kind of getting won over, but very, very resistant. And of course he had a whole lifetime of planning out what he was going to do. He was living very peaceful until Srila Prabhupada and the ISKCON devotees moved into the property down the road. So one day Prabhupada called for him, and Bhagaji came in and sat down. Prabhupada was sitting at his desk in his room in Krishna Balaram temple. So Prabhupada said to him, he said, "It is the duty of every Indian gentleman to teach the teachings of Lord Krishna. Do you agree?" And Bhagaji says, yes, and he agreed with this. And Prabhupada said, "It is also the duty of every Indian gentleman to set aside some time in his life to propagate these teachings. Do you agree?" And Bhagaji was, yes, I agree. So there was a whole number of things which Prabhupada, and he said, Prabhupada said, if there was a need, if Western people would come to a person with, they're eager for Krishna, this gentleman, he would help. Bhagaji said, yeah, he was agreeing. So point by point, Prabhupada got him to agree that, if needs be, then a person would set aside their particular devotional aspirations in order to, help people and spread Lord Chaitanya's Sankirtan movement. So they were talking for 10 minutes. I was sitting in the room listening. So he was talking for about 10 minutes. So then Prabhupada said, "Brahmananda?" I said, "Yes, Prabhupada." He said, "Bring the paper." So Brahmananda brought the paper, and he gave it to Prabhupada, and Prabhupada handed it to Bhagaji, and Bhagaji he looked so alarmed. And later I learned it was a legal document, which Bhagaji had to sign to say that he was the new trustee of the Krishna Balaram temple. So he was just absolutely shocked that, he was trying to do his bhajan, now he is a manager of the temple, the trustee in charge of everything. He was just so, and then Prabhupada just went over one by one the points that he had made to which Bhagaji had agreed, every single one of them. Prabhupada just went through 10 points, all the points that he had given that Bhagaji had agreed to. And the natural conclusion was that he would officially sign this document, which would just legalize all of the points which he had just agreed to in the last 10 minutes. So he was looking at the document, and Prabhupada just went over all the points again, and he went over the points, and Bhagaji just started laughing. He just, he realized that he had been outplayed. He had been, it was checkmate, and so he just laughed, and he took the pen, and he just surrendered to Prabhupada, and he said, "Okay," so, and then he was the trustee for a great many years.
One time, Srila Prabhupada was asked in a challenging way, "Since you're the guru and you know everything, how many windows are in the Empire State Building?" Srila Prabhupada replied, "How much water is in a mirage?" How brilliant, because What's the significance of how many windows there are in the Empire State Building? It's as significant as how much water is in a mirage, and both are illusion. So we know the guru, we can ask relevant questions.
So in Miami, Prabhupada actually, the way he pronounced it, he said kind of like, Miami. And he liked it, and he said that the vegetation reminded him of India, the weather reminds one of India, and he appreciated it very much.
On our return trip, we stopped, I think it was in Surat, and this encounter, this was documented, and there's a lot of nice film of that. And then we'd gone to Indore, but in the train there was a mix-up, and they were not able to get Srila Prabhupada a first-class ticket, and so he rode with us in third class. So third class is, you can't even imagine that, how inconvenient it is. But I was in charge of the food. I had a bunch of savories and things such as that, and I had been carrying them with me on the journey. And then Srila Prabhupada asked me, says, "I'm hungry, please feed me." So I gave him some samosa and some kachoris, and he began eating them. And then he pointed to the other devotees and said, "Please feed everybody, give these devotees." So I gave everyone their remnants or their prasadam. And then he looked at me and says, "Now you eat." So I began eating, and then he said, "Give me another kachori." And so I'm thinking that my right hand is dirty, and what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And in the third class cars, every third car, they had a little tiny water fountain in the sink. And so in order for me to get there and wash my hand and run back, it would take a long amount of time. So I kept looking down the aisleway like this. And Srila Prabhupada, he knew what I was thinking, because he says, "You may use your left hand." He said, "Sometimes the left hand is okay." So just for me, and there were many instances where he knew what I was thinking, and he responded in kind. So one other example of this is, this was in Mayapur, and this was, I think, in 1974, when they had one of the first big, Mayapur festivals where devotees from other countries had come. And we were on a morning walk. There was a limited number of us walking with Srila Prabhupada along the Ganga. And as we were walking, in the bushes on the side, there were people who were doing their morning duties, and the smells were wafting up. And there was a pansiwala, that's the boatman, plying his boat along the edge of the river back and forth. And Srila Prabhupada was looking at that, and then he began to tell us the stories of Gopal Ban, between him and Krishnagar, and how, passing stool and this and that. And when Srila Prabhupada began to tell these stories, this was the first time that I'd ever heard him, in any respect at all, have some type of mundane conversation, and he was telling us these stories of, and I'm thinking, where's the spiritual input into this? And I was very confused, and then he said, the spiritual significance is very subtle, So he knew what I was thinking, so.
On the Radha Damodar bus, I would oftentimes wake up one of the first ones. And at that time, Vishnu John Maharaj would do some cooking for Radha Damodar, and I would help him and assist him. So oftentimes it was my service also to prepare the Charnamrita and different things after the deities have been worshipped. In many other temples at the time, they used some thick yogurt that they mixed the Charnamrita with. It was very thick. but it seemed more like yogurt than Charnamrita to me. So I put in just a little bit of yogurt and made it more watery than it was thick. So when Srila Prabhupada came onto the bus, he went over, took darshan, then he took the Charnamrita, and when he took it, he looked at it, and he went, and then, oh, just like India. And then that was, it was noticeable. He noticed it.
Well, our traveling party, I was on a girls' book distributing party in the summer of '76, and we were following Srila Prabhupada around to a lot of different temples. And one of the things we got to do was go to the New York Rath Yatra, where Srila Prabhupada was. It was his first Rath Yatra that he came to. And at the end, when we were at the end of the parade, Kirtananda was whisking him away, and nobody saw it. And I saw it with another girl, so I kind of nudged her and I said, Prabhu, look, there goes Prabhupada. Oh my gosh, he's all alone with Kirtananda. So we went running over to the limo. And we got right next to the limo, and the kirtan party was coming, and we were chanting and dancing right next to Prabhupada, Haribo, Haribo. And Prabhupada kind of made a motion with his garland, like he was going to take one off. And I said, oh, Jai, Srila Prabhupada, I'll take your garland. And he ended up smiling at me real big. He had a big twinkle in his eye. And he ended up taking his garland off. And he leaned over Kirtananda, and he handed it to me out of the window. And it was just in time because all the senior men were going to be there in like 2 seconds. And I knew I'd get knocked out of the way. So to make this story, a little of the background knowledge for it was that the summer before that Rath Yatra, I was in a really bad car accident with 3 other Sankirtan girls. And by the side of the car, my head was off. I mean, I had sustained really massive injuries. None of us really should have lived through it. We ended up in intensive care a long time. So to maintain any spiritual consciousness, and I wasn't initiated yet, and I was trying to chant, but it was almost physically impossible. I went through all the fields and meadows of New Vrindavan, picking all the wildflowers that I used to pick for Prabhupada to make his garlands when I was back at New Vrindavan. So it really made it meaningful to me that when he handed me his garland, he knew what I was trying to remember at the time of death, what I thought was going to be the time of death, and I was only 20-something years old then. So it was very meaningful to me that Prabhupada had me, because as soon as I started doing that, I became very calm, even though everybody around me was telling me I was dead. So it was very meaningful when Prabhupada handed me his garland with a twinkle in his eye. I just felt like he knew. The third part of the story, which was really significant to me, is later on, 6 months later, I was out for the Christmas marathon, and I just happened to call home. I went talking to a couple of college friends. I called a friend of mine who is now an airline stewardess, and she said, oh, I had that guru of yours on a flight. She was a cross-country stewardess. And she said, I asked him about you, and I was like, oh my gosh, Vicky, what did you do? And she told me she knew he was a special person to me. So when she had him on a flight, she kept going up to him, asking him if he needed water, if he needed 7-Up. It got to be the end of the flight, and she couldn't hold back anymore. And she said, I have a good friend of mine, and she's at that farm of yours in West Virginia, and she's just been in a horrible car accident, and we want to know, I'd like to know if she's all right. Are they taking care of her? And she thought maybe he wasn't going to answer. He just looked out the window for a minute. And then he turned around and said to her, I am aware of it, Krishna is aware of it, and she will be fine. And I was just like, oh, Vicky, you're such an airhead. This happened 6 months ago and you didn't tell me. Prabhupada knows who I am. Krishna knows who I am. I was just like dancing in the airport by now, I was just like so ecstatic, to hear that story. So it just kind of confirmed what I thought.
Another time in Mayapur, another shocking, amazing thing was when Balamardan and his wife Taitreya, they'd been, I don't want to say ruling over the Brooklyn Temple, but it's a well-known fact that they were called Maharani and Maharaj, although he was no longer a sannyasi, so I guess they considered themselves some sort of nobility. But I'd been in India and I'd left but so as things unfolded, got to the point in one evening, and several proofs had been given that Bali Radhan was completely, his wife was completely bogus. So just to enforce that, reinforce that that understanding, the devotees were saying how Guru Kripa and several devotees had tried to speak Japanese with her. She didn't respond, and it was pretty much a done deal that she wasn't who she said she was. So, and Prabhupada was also saying, well, she's his mother's age. I could understand she's his mother's age. He also said that I never instructed him to marry. Actually, I could understand that he was having illicit connection with this woman. He had said that earlier to Brahmananda, early in the day. I heard that. So at this point, it's already nighttime. There's no lights. There's only a kerosene lantern. And all these things have been said. And it was just about to, everything's just about to hit the fan, more or less. It was hitting. And so Prabhupada, during a little bit of a pause, and he said, "It is a great mystery, is it not?" Like that. And everybody was real quiet. And it was just a Prabhupada-ism that just sticks in your head, It is a great mystery, is it not? In the grave voice of Prabhupada, It's a great mystery. I mean, mystery really is like, wow. Who could fall for this, or why, when, and how?
A year later, my parents, who were elderly, came to visit from Florida. And Leela told us about her experience on Sankirtan. And my mother said, "I'd like to do that." And my father said, "I would too." So the devotees there gave my parents some back to Godheads. And there they were, walking up and down the street, offering the Back to Godhead magazines. And every time someone would accept it, my father would clap. He was so happy that people were showing an interest. But he was even happier, both of them were, when I brought them here. And as we enter the temple doors, my father, in his enthusiasm, was so happy that I remember he bent down and kissed the door. He walked in and he looked at the deities and he said, "This is the nicest thing I ever saw in my whole life." That's something to remember.
So, one day, one devotee came from Punjab. And he came down and he said, "Srila Prabhupada, I'm preaching in Punjab." He said, "There's a gentleman who owns land in Kurukshetra, and he's willing to give us the land to build a temple." Srila Prabhupada said, "Tell the gentleman that we will build a very nice temple there with Krishna and Arjuna, Radha Parasarati. He would we build a very nice temple with Krishna on the chariot, but we'll build that. But he must give us very clear title to the land." He said, "We are not interested to develop another person's land. If he gives us the land, gives us clear title to the land," he said, "we will build a very nice temple there." So then he said to the devotee, he said, "Who is your preaching partner? You have come alone. Who is your preaching partner?" And the brahmachari says, "Prabhupada, I don't have a preaching partner. I'm just there by myself." So Prabhupada said, "This is not good." He said, "You must have a preaching partner." So then he turned to the GBC of Vrindavan. India had been split into several zones. So at the time, Vrindavan was a separate zone. Vrindavan was a separate zone from Delhi. So he turned to the GBC from Vrindavan and he said, "Give a preaching..." No, I'm sorry. Delhi and Vrindavan were one zone, but it was a separate zone from Punjab. So he said, "Give a partner, give someone to preach with this person, give someone." So the GBC there says, "Prabhupada, I don't have any extra people." It wasn't his zone, he had no interest to give a good man away to another zone. He said, "Srila Prabhupada, I don't have any extra people." And Prabhupada said, "There are so many people who come for darshan to see me every day." He said, "This is just a complete mismanagement. This is a complete waste." He said, "One of those people, they can come. They've got nothing else to do if they're coming to see me." He said, "They can be the preaching partner." And he said, no, Srila Prabhupada, he said, I've stopped that. No one else is coming. He said, I don't have any extra people. And he says, well, give him. And he pointed to me. I was just a young boy. I was the Prachari. He said, give him. He said, he can preach. He said, let him go. And the GBC said, Srila Prabhupada, he said, we need him. He said, he is the Pujari here. Srila Prabhupada says, Pujari, he says, this is 5th class. He said, anyone can offer some tulsi and some water. He said, let him go and preach. He said, preaching, this is 1st class. He said, he should go and preach. So I joined the person. I was his preaching partner. Prabhupada said, Pujari, he said, this is 5th class. Anyone can do this. Let him preach.
In 1975, again in Chicago, this was in the summer, I believe in June, and of course I was on this library party and we traveled constantly. We had no home. Our home was the van. And all year around we were distributing books. So on the occasion of Prabhupada being in Chicago, we had this very rare weekend off, or a couple of weekdays off. We were just going to stay. And the devotee who was cooking for Srila Prabhupada was a good friend. He said, would you like to help me cook for Prabhupada? And I had always cherished the idea of doing some personal service for Prabhupada. So yes, of course, I'd be very happy to. So he showed me how to make sandesh. And I worked very hard making the sandesh. And when it was time to bring the offering to Prabhupada, he said, would you like to take it in? And I said, of course. So I took the tray into Prabhupada, just me and Prabhupada alone in the room. And I offered the tray and left. Prabhupada didn't say anything, just looked at me. Then when he rang a few minutes later, the devotee told me this means he's through. So again I came in, took the tray and left. And I noticed he had eaten 2 of the sandesh. I was very happy. And I was thinking now I'll get some remnants from Prabhupada. The moment I closed his door, the secretary's door opened. I don't know if we name names. It was Brahmananda, big Brahmananda. Where's Prabhupada's plate? Took the whole thing. So the next day my friend came to me kind of sheepishly and he said, I said, did Prabhupada say something? I thought maybe he liked sandesh or something. He said, yes. He said, why are so many men staying back from book distribution to cook for me? So although I had cherished the desire to serve Prabhupada personally, from that instruction I could understand that serving the order of the spiritual master is much more important than serving the body of the spiritual master.
We felt very comfortable with the fact that she was involved in something that was so beneficial for her. But in addition, I felt the need that we needed for ourselves was coming from our own child. Up until then, we had very little religious feelings. Both my parents were very young people and had no opportunity, financially and otherwise, to get involved in a religion, which would have suited them, I think, at that time. But it wasn't until they met the devotees and heard about the temple and came to the temple. As a matter of fact, the temple in Florida, South Florida, where they lived, they had signed up. My father had signed up for he and my mother to move into the temple. Now then, they said, I remember one walk we took, and I said, Pop, that's fine, but you can't smoke any cigars. He said, I only smoke one. I said, not even one, Pop. He takes the cigar out of his pocket. He breaks it in half. He said, okay, I'm done.
Often Srila Prabhupada would give very concise philosophical purports. I remember one time he was explaining that Sahajya was much better than Mayavadi. He said, better to be a Sahajya than to be a Mayavadi. He said, with the Sahajya, there is some type of connection to Krishna. He said it's not considered a very, very elevated connection, but at least some connections there. He said, but for Mayavadi, he said there was just absolutely no hope.
So Prabhupada would give a nice lecture, and this one night, the Sankirtan Matajis were all invited to that darshan. Different people were invited at different times. So Prabhupada was lecturing, and then all of a sudden, one of the Matajis started coughing, you know, quite a bit. So Prabhupada stopped the lecture and looked at her and said, what is wrong? You don't have sufficient clothing? Because I don't know if he didn't think, but it got cool that evening, and so he said, you don't have sufficient clothing? And then he said, who is in charge? So I was the Sankirtan leader, and I was, thankfully, nobody, you know, pointed me out, or nobody said anything, and he went on with his class, and finished his class and that, but I realized then the lesson that I had learned that, you know, Srila Prabhupada, he's opening temples all over the world. He's responsible for so many devotees. He's our guru, but yet he was so concerned about just one of the devotees, you know, and he had so much compassion and kindness for the devotees. So right after that happened, I made plans, and I discussed with Kirtanananda to get very nice clothing for all the Sankirtan devotees, nice vans, nice facility, made sure they went out with enough bread, food, and different things, you know. Really tried my best to look after them, and those material things, because Prabhupada had asked about, why is your warm clothes, that type of thing. So it was a real good lesson that we have to take care of the devotees so they could do their service, because they were sacrificing so much, leaving New Vrindavan for long periods of time and doing such difficult service. So I felt that the best we could look after them would please Srila Prabhupada.
I remember a couple devotees had thought, well, what can we get Prabhupada? We want to give him something different that nobody else ever gave him. So they, in Miami, they had a lot of dabs, or coconut, that you drink the coconut juice out of. So they said, let's give him a straw made of gold. So they actually they got a straw. I mean, it was like a gold pipe of a real solid gold, a thin pipe. So they gave this to Prabhupada. And somehow a piece of coconut Prabhupada started to use it, because as soon as he was at the airport and getting in his car, they gave it to him, a dab to drink and the straw. So some piece must have got caught in the straw. So I remember after it didn't work, he just took it and threw it down. I realized from that, of course, that to the guru, you know, anything material, it doesn't matter what it is, that's not the essence. The essence is Krishna. So the material things didn't matter so much to him.
And I remember Srila Prabhupada once said, when he was asked the process for the disciple going back to Godhead, and Srila Prabhupada said that the spiritual master has purchased your ticket. It's like you want to get on a train, you have to show your ticket. Prabhupada said, I have purchased your ticket. You simply have to get on board, and you have to stay on the train till we get to the destination. So this was the meaning of Jagat Guru, that Prabhupada has the ability, he has purchased the ticket for everyone, because he's the full manifestation of Krishna in the form of spiritual master. So he is the deliverer, because he is speaking as Krishna.
Srila Prabhupada was very surprising. He was a very amazing man to me. I was constantly surprised at his different qualities, at his different reactions. He was just very, very amazing. I was completely intrigued. I was a young boy. I was living in the temple. I stayed a year at the Berry Place temple before I went to India. So it was just in this first bit. I may have been a devotee for about 6 months. So I was up in Prabhupada's room chanting and watching Prabhupada sitting behind his desk chanting. He had a very, very low desk on the first floor of Berry Place. He had a very, very low coffee table type desk. And he had a low, not so much an asan, but he had cushions. He had a big cushion he sat on, and there was a round type of bolster cushion behind him, and 2 at each side. So he would just laying very casually, chanting, and I was just chanting. There was 2 or 3 of us in the room chanting. So this one devotee came in. He had been a devotee for 2 years. He liked to boast, I'm the first devotee in Europe. I've been a devotee for 2 years. I'm a Brahmin. He was very, and we thought he was just such an advanced devotee because he was 2 years and we had just been a few months. So he came into the room and he was very dramatic, and he said, Srila Prabhupada, he said, every time I feel I'm making advancement, he said, I have a fall down. He said, this has happened so many times. He said, I just do not know if I can find the strength to pick myself up again. So I was looking and looking at Prabhupada, and Prabhupada just totally surprised me. He lay back on his cushion with his head facing the ceiling, and he just rippled with laughter. And I had never seen Prabhupada laugh. It was a whole body laugh. He was heaving and laughing. His whole body was moving. And I was just completely amazed, because hitherto I had saw this very grave, very philosophical, and he was just laughing like a young boy. And it seemed to go on really for 2 or 3 minutes. I was just totally bewildered and totally surprised. And then Srila Prabhupada brought his head back down, and he had a nice fatherly smile. And he looked at the devotee and he said, just as a child, an infant, he said, just as an infant, when learning to walk, he said he falls down so many times, but he picks himself up and persists and learns to walk. He said after some time he can run, he can jump. Srila Prabhupada said, do so many wonderful athletic things. He said, but do not think you are a big advanced devotee when you are still an infant in spiritual life.
So there was a time in '74 when I was asked to do a painting of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta for the temple, and we didn't have any reference at the temple, so I was sent next door, right next door to one of Prabhupada's godbrothers to get a reference from a book. So when I got there, this godbrother, he'd been coming around to see Prabhupada. Prabhupada knew him very well. So as soon as I came there, he told me he didn't have that. He looked a little bit, but he realized his book that he had that picture in was stored at a different mott down the ways. So meanwhile, I was with him for 45 minutes, an hour at least, just because he talked. And one thing he kept reiterating was that I should go to Sridhar Maharaj, that he was a living guru. And so my first instinct was to say, and I did say it once at least, until he kept on. I just said, well, Prabhupada's a living guru. I kind of said it like, but I realized kind of at the same time that this man wasn't completely intelligent, because it didn't seem like a right thing to say to me. I mean, living guru, what does he mean? Why is Prabhupada's godbrother a living guru, and Prabhupada's not a living guru? I mean, this is 1974, you know. So he kept saying it. He must have said it 7, 8 times in an hour. You should go to Sridhar Maharaj. He is a living guru. So anyway, I just listened to him. I walked with him to the mott. I got the book. And then when I came, I told the leaders there, Bhavananda and Jaya Gaura, I said, you know, what he said is kind of funny, you know, probably we should go. Anyway, I didn't think of it. And then later, Bhavananda had gone up to see Prabhupada in Bombay. He mentioned this story. So Prabhupada's response, he said, was immediate. He got very angry. His lip was quivering practically in anger, very disturbed. And he said, I am not there, but you tell him for me he is nothing but a bed bug. Of course, I don't think they did that, but he said it. Nothing but a bed bug. He has taken sannyas 30 years ago, and he's done nothing but suck the blood of my Guru Maharaj, which is what bed bugs do. So Prabhupada is very protective of his ISKCON. We didn't have the adhikar to say such things, so it wasn't conveyed, and it couldn't have been conveyed except by Prabhupada. And it's doubtful if Prabhupada actually saw him, if he'd have said that exactly at that, but he, you know, Prabhupada had that mood, heavy mood.
And he was giving a lecture from the Srimad Bhagavatam in the morning about King Indra, that King Indra had taken, impersonated himself as one of the great sages and had some sex with the sage's wife. And he was cursed by the sage to have vaginas on his body, but these vaginas were turned into eyes. So it's a little bit, embarrassing to hear him mention the word vagina. But at a certain point in the story, he just looked up and he said, "So, you can either love Krishna or love vagina," just like that. And I remember I turned completely red. But as I've been meditating on that more and more throughout my life, I realized that that is actually absolute, at least within material nature, that you can either love Krishna or love vagina. It may be a little hard to take to hear this story, but that's the instruction.
I must tell you that on Sundays, Sam and I used to go down to the beach in Santa Barbara, where there is always a gathering of artists and so forth that meet there. And we got to meet many people of the movie industry through that. Not Barbara Streisand, it was Meryl Streep, I remember, who bought some cookies from us. And she said, as she picked up the package, she looked at it and she said, "Oh, this is the Hare Krishna. How do you say it?" And so we chanted with her and she chanted with us, which is very nice.
So one day, there was about 6 or 8 people in his room, and I was sitting there listening, and he was asking these people to come and join him, that they should, help in Lord Chaitanya's mission. There was such a need in the Western world. It was so, bereft of any spiritual understanding. There was such a need. And the Western people are so keen, they're so eager for this. We have so many temples and selling so many. He said, "You please come and help me." So he said, these my disciples, he said, they know nothing. I need people to instruct them. So one Western devotee, he was listening, and he said, "But Prabhupada, not all of your devotees." He said, "What about the pundits?" And Prabhupada said, "Pundits?" He said, "What pundits?" He said, "Prabhupada, your Western pundits, your Western disciples, the pundits." And Prabhupada said, "Pundits?" And he said to the audience, he said, "They do not know how to go to the market to buy themselves an apple." He said, "We have no pundits."
So in Atlanta in 1975, we were on a morning walk with Srila Prabhupada, I and my mates on the library party. And one of them asked, "Prabhupada, we sometimes go to anthropology departments, and they ask, if the Vedic culture is so ancient, where are the bones? Why are there no remnants from that day and age?" And Prabhupada said, "Because they burn the bodies. That's civilized." And then he stopped for a moment and said, "It's anthropologists, just like dogs, digging for bones." I guess what really amazes me about Prabhupada, because I so much relish everything he does. I mean, that he was expert in everything. He was an expert cook. And he could cook. He cooked a feast on Bhaktisiddhanta's appearance day in an hour and a half, a 10-course feast. He had about 4 or 5 devotees helping him. But by the time he had finished cooking the feast in an hour and a half, the whole kitchen was clean. The pots were dirty. His kirtans are just, they're like incredible. They're like right out of the spiritual world. And they're totally musically, perfect. And the way his writing, everything that he did, he was so expert, and he was the best at it. The best cook, the best kirtanier, the best speaker, the best writer, everything. He did. He did it amazingly. Yeah.
Srila Prabhupada was very, very clever in giving philosophical concepts in a very clear, concise, practical way. One day he explained, he gave a story one day. He said there was a king, and the king had a Brahmin who was his advisor. And some of the other ministers, they were a little upset that the Brahmin advisor, he would get so many facilities, but he didn't seem to do too much. They said, we are so busy going around the kingdom collecting taxes and overseeing the borders and so many things, but this Brahmin, he just doesn't seem to do much, yet he has so much facility, and this is upsetting us a bit, and we would like him not to, hang around the palace anymore. So the king said, he said, let me consider your offer, let me consider your request. And he said, I will discuss with you in the morning. He said, in the meantime, he said, I would like you to tell me the concise weight of the two royal elephants. There's the he elephant and there's the she elephant. And he said, I would like to know exactly what they weigh. He said, could you please do this for me? And when you come tomorrow, he said, give me this information. So the next morning, he asked for the Brahmin to come to his room, his state room. So the Brahmin was there. And then the ministers arrived. And they said, he said, what is the weight of the elephant? And they said, well, we don't exactly know because we put him on the scale, but the scale broke, and then we tried to hoist them with ropes, and then the ropes broke, but we have an idea. We think, and the king says, well, do you know precisely what they weigh? They said, no, I'm afraid we don't know. He said, okay. He said, Panditji, he said, I would like you to weigh concisely the two royal elephants. He said, can you do this for me? So the Pandit said, my lord, he said, may I have the use of the royal barge? And the king said, yes, of course. And he said, may I have access for a short period to the grain storehouses where we keep the palace rice? And the king said, yes. He said, I will give you this information in a few hours. So the king invited them all to come back in the afternoon. So in the afternoon, the Pandit, he was waiting. He said, a little more time, sir. Then some messenger came and gave them the information. He said, king, he said, sir, he said, the male elephant weighs so many thousand kilos, so many pounds, so many this. He gave a concise figure. He said, and the she elephant, she's a little lighter, she weighs this. And the king said, well, how did you arrive at this information? He said, well, sir, he said, first of all, one at a time, I put the elephants on the royal barge. He said, then I measured how much the water had been displaced. He said, then, bag by bag, I put rice in. It came to that amount. He said, then we simply counted the rice. He said, I gave instructions for them to do this. So he said, the messenger has just arrived with this information. He said, so by this water displacement and then get an equal displacement by known measures of rice in precise amounts in the bags, he said, then we counted. He said, this is exactly what they weigh. So then he turned to the ministers and he said, so now do you understand why I keep Panditji? And then Prabhupada went on to explain that there was four different varnas. He said that there was the Kshatriya, the Brahmin, and he said the Brahmin is governed by lazy intelligence. He said this minister, this advisor, he was a lazy man, but an intelligent man. He said this is the Brahmins. He said, and the Kshatriyas, he said they are active intelligence. And he said the Vaishyas, he said they are lazy foolishness. He said this is the Vaishya. And he said the Sudras, they are active foolishness. So he said these are the four divisions: Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Sudra. Lazy foolishness, active foolishness, lazy intelligence, and active intelligence. Prabhupada. So just in a very, very simple, very, very concise way, Prabhupada just explained what were the characteristics of the different orders.
I was invited into Srila Prabhupada's room. And he was lying in a bed with a very high headboard. And I actually had to stand on my tiptoes to reach over the headboard to get to Srila Prabhupada's face. And it was a little bit uncomfortable, actually, more than uncomfortable. It's quite uncomfortable because the headboard was hitting me in the armpits. But I didn't care about that discomfort. I was about to massage the head of the pure devotee, and I did. And as I was massaging Srila Prabhupada's head, it was of course an ecstatic experience, and perhaps too ecstatic, because I fell into a kind of ecstasy, and suddenly there was a Shakti jolt, and it was like an experience like you've seen the cartoons where the cat gets his tail stuck in the socket and there's a skeleton. It was some kind of powerful, energetic jolt ran through me. But then the next moment, Srila Prabhupada moved, and he moved like lightning fast. It was like Bruce Lee. Both of his hands came off the bed and grabbed my wrist with a very, beyond firm, a very strong, vice-like grip, and he pulled my hands up and down on his face, and then his hands went back to the bed, just like so quickly. And I perceived immediately three communications in that movement. First of all was, okay, you got that Shakti connection that you were seeking. But work now, samadhi later. Don't pay more attention to your service than to the ecstasy of executing this service. And then was the fact that he really wanted me to work harder. And so I did. I massaged his head with more vigor. And shortly thereafter, then Abhiram Prabhu came in and said, okay, time, come on out. So I came away from that experience clear in my mind that although Prabhupada appeared to be a skeleton upon which was hung beautiful, shining, bronze-colored silk as his skin, and appeared to be in such a weakened condition that all the devotees were just heartbroken to see him in such a condition and seeking to render service to him in various ways. But I knew that this was Leela. He was very strong. He was extremely powerful. His grip was very firm, like a strong young man. And so I was able to perceive how marvelous are the pastimes of the pure devotee of the Lord.
Of course, Srila Prabhupada is always with us, reciprocating. I remember in Los Angeles, when Prabhupada was going back to India. He had not been well at the time, and Prabhupada didn't know. He was thinking that he may never come back to America. And that's when Srila Prabhupada first told us about Vani and Vapu. And Srila Prabhupada explained about Vani and the presence of the spiritual master through the transcendental media of sound vibration. And Prabhupada explained how Vani is much more intimate than Vapu, or the physical form. So this was, Prabhupada was giving us this realization because we were all on the bodily concept and we were on the bodily platform. But the relationship with the spiritual master, and by purport the relationship with Krishna, it has nothing to do with the bodily concept. So for all of us, and all of the generations who come after, who didn't have Srila Prabhupada's physical association, it's not as important as having Prabhupada's association through his vibration in his books, in his lectures, in his remembrances. Everyone, for the next 10,000 years, can have the exact same sense of intimacy of Srila Prabhupada as his closest disciples that were near him physically. It's like Prabhupada explained, even when Lord Krishna was here, the vast majority of people, They didn't understand who Krishna was, even though they may have been there. It's on a transcendental platform. Same with Srila Prabhupada. How many understood who Srila Prabhupada is? So understand who Srila Prabhupada is. And Srila Prabhupada is there for us in a very intimate, loving, transcendental, reciprocating way.
He made it easy for me to respond to whatever he would have asked me. I felt comfortable with him. As some young people would, if they saw a movie star, oh, they're in awe. But Prabhupada didn't make you feel that way. If anything, when I did see him in the temple, it was, there were things that I want to say. I want to ask him questions. I'd want to hear what he would say on a conversational level, because it wasn't, I'm so important. He didn't give that impression. He was a bearer of information. He was delivering information. And he did it in such a calm, in such a way that it wasn't frightening, it wasn't, it was informational. I have something to tell you, and I think you will be interested in hearing this. That. I do remember when he walked out of the temple after a lecture, and the devotees were all eager to show their obeisances to him. And they all scrambled to get down on, he went, motioned with his hands, get up, get up, get up. You know, that wasn't necessary.
The qualities that stand out most, or that stood out to me most about Srila Prabhupada was that he wanted to flood the world with Krishna consciousness, and that he had unlimited knowledge, and that, you know, he gave you a lot of confidence. He gave you confidence in him because he was so completely sure and certain, and he had so much faith that this was absolute knowledge, and that, you know, he had that air, that pride that, you know, this is the ultimate. If you follow me, you'll be okay.
Je anilo